Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Joanna Schug. She is Associate Professor of Psychology at the College of William and Mary. Her areas of specialization include cross-cultural psychology, social psychology, and socio-ecological approaches to human behavior. And today we're going to focus on the socio-ecological approach, on facial expressions of emotion, relational mobility, and other topics of her work. So, Dr. Schug, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, great. So, the first question I would like to ask you is, what is the socio-ecological approach about? It is an approach within social psychology, is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly interdisciplinary approach. So we call it the socio-ecological approach. Other people have used other words like the eco-cultural approach. It might be similar to things like the institutional approach used in economics. But the social ecological approach, what we call it, basically is thinking about human behavior and psychology as adapted to their different types of environments. So, behavioral ecologists in biology might study how an animal or an organism adapts its behavior to certain incentive structures in the environment or the natural environment or niche construction. And we're kind of doing the same thing with humans, only we are putting an emphasis on the social ecological approach in the sense that many of the ecologies that humans are embedded in are actually created by other humans, right? So it's, we're adapting ourselves not only to our physical environments, but also our social environments. So it would take things like historical factors like sustenance styles, what sorts of agriculture different populations have used, pathogen prevalence, composition of social networks. You could even think about types of legal systems or institutions, right, that maybe economists might be more likely to do. Others have looked at things like residential mobility, right, and how these different types of social environments that people are embedded in might influence human behavior and psychology.
So you take into account a lot of cultural and social factors there, right?
Yes, yeah. Right. And it's a kind of a macro systems approach, which can get a little bit complicated. So the idea is that humans adapt their behaviors to their social environments, but their social environments are also comprised of those very behaviors that are elicited by the environment, right? So I like to think of a social ecology as kind of an equilibrium state that's balanced between people's behaviors, which create the incentives that drive other people's behaviors, which go back and create incentives for others. So it's kind of like this self-sustaining institution or equilibrium in many cases, right? And some of the historical factors can set that equilibrium into motion, and then the cultural systems will sustain themselves over time.
Is there a little bit of evolutionary psychology in it? I'm asking because when I think about the word ecology, I usually associate it with things coming from biology, and then, nowadays with the discipline of evolutionary psychology, ecological factors are also taken into account there, and we tend to associate them with how our brains, from a, let's say, evolutionary slash biological perspective, process cues and other types of information from the environment we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would argue that this is compatible with evolutionary theories of behavior. Um, I think at least especially modern evolutionary theory takes into account kind of these evolutionarily instilled instincts or cognitive mechanisms and how they might adapt themselves or be calibrated to specific types of environments, right? So I think people who study animals would not disagree with this. So the idea is that humans as a species, we share a lot of kind of evolutionarily instilled programs, but depending on the types of environments that we're embedded in, these programs may be calibrated differently or turned off or on, depending on whether they're useful or not.
So let's talk now a little bit about facial expressions and how people read them cross-culturally. Um,
Yeah.
is there any basic set of cues that people from different cultures use to read the same basic emotions or not?
Yeah, well, I think the question here is not about reading emotional expressions necessarily, but about producing emotional expressions.
Okay.
I think it's important to keep in mind that when it comes to emotion recognition, there's a lot of variability even on an individual level. So one person might be better or worse than another person at detecting someone else's emotion. We also see a lot of cultural variability in how well different cultures are on average to detect certain types of emotion. But the universality, I think, comes more from the expression of the emotions themselves, right? So there have been a lot of studies, going back 50 years that have shown that there seem to be some basic configurations of facial musculature that get activated when people are experiencing situations that might elicit what they call basic emotions, like things like anger, disgust, or happiness, right? So if I'm angry and I have no reason to modify my expression, chances are I will show some sort of prototypical display of anger, which might be, I would maybe press my lips together and widen my eyes while simultaneously lowering my eyebrows. And this seems to happen cross culturally, right? There's a lot of person to person variation, situation to situation variation. It's not that every person in every situation is going to show this exact prototypical emotion, but this is a pattern that does seem to be shown across human populations and to some extent in other species like great apes, right, chimpanzees, and so forth. And so, given that these emotions seem to be expressed in ways that are universal, we would also expect that cross culturally, people will at least recognize these expressions, right? I'm not sure. And again, this isn't actually my area of focus. So, I don't know if I can speak with so much authority right here, but um, I don't know if it's necessarily the case that people are born with the ability to recognize these expressions or whether they learn to recognize the expressions simply because humans have a tendency to universally express these emotions, right? A lot of people would argue with me either way, so I won't make a claim one way or the other. Just that I do believe that there are evolutionarily instilled programs for the expression of emotions. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. And you are referring to the work that was done by people like Paul Ekman, right?
Yes,
With
yeah,
the six basic emotions: sadness, happiness, anger. I mean, I'm missing the surprise,
yeah. Surprise,
disgust.
disgust, contempt. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Those kinds of things. So, at least those six emotions, you think that they have been confirmed as human universals?
Yeah, and that's not to say those are the only emotions that exist in the world. I think a lot of the debate in this area comes from what people call an emotion. Some people refer when you say emotion, of course, we use that term in our daily language, and so we have this idea about what an emotion is and what it's not. The basic emotions are the ones that people like Paul Ekman and others have studied that seem to be replicated across cultures. Of course, now there are new ones like pride, for instance, or shame that also seem to be potentially universal. Um, so it's not the case that those are the only emotions or that those are the only universal emotions. And you could even argue that there are other emotions that aren't expressed on the face that are probably universal, such as love, right? So love, you can find poems or songs in just about every culture that describe something that would be similar to what we think of in the West as romantic love. But unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a reliable facial indicator of whether someone is in love with you. If there were, that would actually make life really easy, but unfortunately, that doesn't seem to exist. So I don't even think people who follow the basic emotions approach would argue that because love is not expressed in the face, it's not an emotion, if that makes sense.
Yes, I understand. But emotional expressivity is something that varies cross-culturally, right? That is, there are cultures where people are more emotionally expressive than others, or is that incorrect?
Yes, I would argue that yes, that is the case. And a lot of times, what governs whether or not we will express an emotion in one situation or another situation is something called display rules. So, kind of social norms that dictate or encourage people to express their emotions in different ways in different contexts, right? So, some people might argue that if there are no constraints on your emotional expression, then many of the cultural differences would go away, for instance. But for instance, in the United States, I think that there's a strong cultural norm that people should always be smiling at each other, right? You should constantly be showing happiness and warmth to each other, friendliness. And if we were to go, someone like me from the United States who's normally smiling all the time and trying to be nice to people, if I were to go somewhere like Russia, right, they probably think I'm just a weirdo. So there are differences in display rules and how cultures um, help regulate in what situations and to what extent people display or modify their emotional expressions.
So I know that you studied for a long time in Japan. Were there big differences in terms of how people express themselves emotionally, in terms of their facial expressions, in terms of the types of contexts and situations where certain emotional expressions are allowed and things
Yeah,
like that?
yeah, absolutely. So, the display rules for emotional expression are fairly different in the United States and Japan. So the idea that most people would not show something like disgust to someone of superior standing than themselves. So, I wouldn't, if I was disgusted by the way my professor was lecturing about something in class, I probably would not show that. Whereas, my students, when I talk about disgusting things in lecture, which I do occasionally when we are talking about the topic of disgust, they definitely will show disgust on their face, right? So, um, but it really depends on the situation. So I think there's kind of a stereotype that people in Japan are not expressive compared to people in the United States, and a lot of that is based on comparing people in social situations where display rules in the United States encourage Americans to overly express their happiness, while display rules in Japan might encourage people to suppress that happiness a little bit. But you could look at other situations, like, for instance, in Japan, there's a huge customer service culture. And customer service cultures in Japan seem to very much encourage the expression of positive emotion, right?
So I asked you this off record, but in terms of the weird psychology, I mean that acronym that we know nowadays.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I was thinking about Japan, and Japan has several different traits that are very similar to a Western country, but then it's not Western at the same time. So, since you've done work particularly on people from Japan and Americans, I mean, would you say that Japan is a sufficiently different culture for us to consider it non-weird?
I mean, it's certainly not weird in the sense that it's not a Western culture, right? So you could argue that it's an eared culture, in the sense that it's educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. But like I mentioned to you earlier, I'm actually grateful for the research on that's kind of focused on the distinction between weird and non-weird cultures, because I believe that's something that really needs to be focused on more in psychology and other behavioral and social sciences. But at the same time, it's still kind of a dichotomy. So you have weird versus non-weird, when really I think what the field needs to be doing is focusing on each one of those letters in the acronym, right? Is it East-West cultural heritage? Is it education? Is it industrialization? Is it wealth? Maybe wealth inequality? Is it the political system? And so social ecological approach would take each of those factors into consideration, right? So for instance, in Japan, Japan is a wealthy country, but it also has a lot lower levels of inequality than somewhere like the United States has, right? So does wealth inequality play a role in influencing people's psychology and behavior? I think it probably does, right? So that would be one dimension that a Japan, Western European, North America comparison would be warranted. Japan also has much better education system than the United States does, right? So that would be another way to compare the two cultures. So I would argue that yes, Japan is sufficiently different in many ways, but it should only be one data point in a broad range of data points collected when you're thinking about cross-cultural issues. Right. My own research often does U.S.-Japan comparisons because that's, kind of what it was convenient to me, especially when I was going to graduate school in Japan. But ultimately, the goal would be to expand that and look at each one of those letters or other socio-ecological factors and how they influence different types of outcomes.
Yeah, particularly when it comes to Eastern Asian countries, like, for example, China and Japan and South Korea and etc., we tend to talk about them as being collectivistic cultures in contrast with, for example, Europe and North America that are more individualistic. Does that make a big difference in terms of exploring certain types of social dynamics?
Yeah, and again, this comes back to the issue of dichotomizing things. So I think as humans, we like to put things into categories because it just is easier for us to think about. So just like I think the issue of weird versus non-weird can be problematic, the idea of individualism versus collectivism in many cases can be problematic because it's painting these different sort of cultural syndromes with a very broad brush. Different scholars have general ideas about what individualism and collectivism are, but in many cases their ideas don't really mesh well with reality. So, I would argue that individualism and collectivism is an important construct, but it needs to be broken down into a subcomponents. So the idea that how much do people actually enjoy interacting with others? How much are they concerned about their reputation, what other people think about them? How much are their incentives driven by the benefits that go to their group as a whole or to the individual, right? And so I think that each one of these different ways of thinking about individualism and collectivism could really change how things end up.
But then sometimes people also associate it in the literature with certain aspects of cognition, like, for example, analytic versus holistic thinking. So, could you tell us a little bit about that, and if it's really the case that, that Eastern Asians, for example, have more of a holistic kind of thinking, and then on the other end, people like we are, Americans, Portuguese people, and so on, are more analytic?
Yeah, so again, a lot of this is coming out of East-West comparisons, and when people do East-West comparisons, inevitably they like to fall back on individualism, collectivism as an explanatory framework. And a lot of the research does suggest that people in Eastern societies, Eastern cultures tend to have more holistic types of cognition. So, they're more likely to consider, for instance, attribution. They're more likely to consider the external forces that might encourage a person to behave in one way or another, whereas people in the United States or Western Europe might be more likely to think about how someone's behavior is driven by internal traits, right? So that would be kind of a holistic and analytic cognition when it comes to attribution. Others have expanded this to look at spatial perception, right? But how much people are likely to pay attention to the environment versus a focal object. So the evidence that shows kind of East-West differences in this pattern, I think, is pretty concrete. Whether it's actually driven by individualism and collectivism or what parts of individualism and collectivism, I think still needs a little bit of work. So my collaborator, Alvaro San Martin, who's in Spain, he did a study, and we worked on this together on looking at relational mobility, which I guess we haven't talked about just yet, but the idea that people have some degree of choice in their personal relationships, right? So if you live in a society with high levels of relational mobility, you have more options to choose from in terms of who one would interact with or not interact with, compared to someone who lives in a society with lower levels of relational mobility, whose social networks are usually going to be predetermined by their social ecology, right, by the environment that they're living in. So people who have more choices probably have a little bit more freedom, right, to behave in accordance with their own personality or their own desires, compared to people who live in lower mobility societies who are in these kind of more embedded social networks that might be enforcing behavior, right? So it may be the case that people in more mobile societies actually have more control, and which makes it more logical for people to use internal attribution compared to external attribution in societies where people's behaviors are more constrained by their social ties.
Mhm. And do you know if people can easily shift between these two different kinds of cognition if they, for example, are raised in one kind of society and then they move to the opposite kind of society? I mean, if they can easily pick up a new kind of cognition from the society they move to.
Yeah, well, first, I think that people will probably not be thinking about which strategy they're going to use by default in their daily life, right? So when we go about our daily life, we're kind of on autopilot. We don't like using our minds. We don't like thinking. Thinking is hard, right? So we're going to try to cut as many corners as possible and probably tune our, basic systems, basic behaviors to whatever type of situation is most common in our environment. So if I live in a society where generally I have to worry about what people think about me, I have to be concerned about my reputation, I have a lot of constraints on my behavior, I'm probably going to use a more holistic strategy in general. On the other hand, if I live in a society where I have fewer constraints on my behavior, right, I have more choice in who I interact with and what situations I choose to be in, then I'm probably going to develop a default strategy. My autopilot is going to be set to assume that everyone else is probably also behaving in accordance with their own desires and beliefs. That said, when you give people blatant cues that that is not the case, right, probably people will be able to switch, right? Whether it's easy or not, I don't know. Whether they'll switch entirely, I also don't know. I think that remains to be seen. But in our data, we collected one study in the paper with Alvaro that looked at whether we could prime, these were American undergraduates, with societies that are high, or situations, I guess, that are higher or lower in relational mobility, compared to a control condition where we didn't prime them with anything. And what we found is that when we prime people with a high mobility situation, so they imagine that they were going to work in a company that had higher levels of relational mobility and describe, the types of things they would do there, that their patterns in that condition tended to resemble the control condition where we didn't give any information, right? So the high mobility pattern seems to be the same as the pattern that people are using in the United States by default. But when we primed them with a low mobility situation, right, so a small company where everyone gets to know each other very well, there are not a lot of opportunities to interact with people outside of the company, then suddenly their attribution styles changed and look more similar to what we would expect from Japanese college students, for instance. So in that case, yes, we did show that we could get, at least in the case of this, kind of simple experimental study, we could get American undergraduates to use more holistic cognition when we prime them with a situation that's lower in mobility. Whether people who are raised in a low mobility environment can do the same thing, I'm not sure, right? If you have lived your entire life in a low mobility environment, or an environment where people don't often have as much choice over their behaviors, telling people suddenly that other people have choice may or may not be able to change their behaviors. So that's something that I think we still need to work on. But yeah, so the idea that we have a default strategy, and assuming that we have the tools available to switch to another strategy, I think people will. But whether or not we have that tool, I think will be determined by the types of situations that people have encountered previously in their life. Or, perhaps some of these tools may be evolutionarily instilled, so everyone will have access to them, and will be able to switch between them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I asked you about that because since there are other aspects of cognition, like for example, just to pick an example, a language, and if people are raised and acquire a particular language, and if they are not exposed to, for example, a second or a third language when they are children or adolescents, for example, then if they have to learn it as adults, then it's much harder for them
Yeah.
to do so. So I was just wondering, I know you already said that we need more research on that, but if that could also be the case with that kind of more holistic versus analytic cognition, for example.
Possibly. I mean, in the case of language, there's certainly a sensitive period, right? So children are able to acquire new languages a lot more than adults. Some people have argued that many aspects of human cultures also have a sensitive period. So we're better at acculturating to a new society when we're younger as opposed to when we're older. So that could definitely influence things. Um, but, say you acquire two languages when you're a child. Um, whether you use one language or another language as an adult will depend on the situation. In the case of relational mobility, or even perhaps analytic and holistic cognition, I think most humans have lived or experienced environments that are low in relational mobility. Our families are inherently low in relational mobility, right? We're never going to replace our parents,
Yeah.
as much as we might want to. But so I like to talk about in the United States middle school, right, or junior high school, or whatever people might call it, right. This is an environment where generally in the United States, and I think in a lot of other countries, people tend to be in the same class for the whole day. They are very conscious about their social relationships with others. They know that being excluded from a group is going to be very damaging because chances are it'll be difficult to find new friends.
Yeah.
Um, so this is an example of a low mobility environment that even people from high mobility societies have experienced. Right. So what I often tell people who are going to visit Japan is to basically behave as if they were in middle school. Right. Be very cautious about what other people think about you. Don't do anything to damage your reputation. You don't do anything that might get you kicked out of your clique or your group that you belong to. And when you explain it like that, I think people get it, right? It's like, oh, okay, this is just a society where I just have to be worried about what people are thinking about me, right? But they might not necessarily think that until you tell them that necessarily.
So, in terms of relational mobility, do you know what are the factors that determine which kind of level of relational mobility occurs in a given society?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more research to be done here, but my collaborators and I have a paper published last year in PNAS that looked at what sort of historical factors correlate with variation in relational mobility across societies. So things like sustenance styles, so more herding in a society historically compared to more like rice paddy farming. Rice paddies type agriculture inherently requires people to be low in mobility, right? You're farming the same land. You often have to negotiate water usage with the people around you. You can't just pick up your rice paddy and move to the next hill if something goes wrong with your relationships, right? So that's an inherently low mobility type society compared to herding cultures that we might see, for instance, in Latin America, where, people can take their livestock and move if they need to. Um, Other things like pathogen prevalence, the type of historic threats, these sort of things would, and this has been argued by others as well, like Michelle Gelfand with her work on cultural tightness and looseness.
Yeah.
These sort of things encourage, if there's a lot of historical threats, they encourage people to kind of band together and stick together and maybe create more cohesive social networks, maybe stronger social norms. So we do find that relational mobility, as we measured it across, I think, 39 different societies, does seem to correlate with these historical outcomes. I could also imagine how different types of legal systems and institutions might influence relational mobility. One really interesting example that I don't think we've explored in the literature, but I always just think that this is interesting, is looking at the divorce rates in Japan.
Hmm.
So if you look at divorce rates in Japan, up until the end of the Meiji era, Japan had the highest level of divorce in the world. Right now, the divorce rate in Japanese society is very low, but up until the end of the Meiji era, so this is early 1900s, there were certain types of legal systems that made it easier for men to decide that they wanted a divorce and then move on to a new wife, for instance. And so that once the legal system changed, we see that the divorce rates in Japan plummeted. Right, so this might have been a kind of a historical drop-off in relational mobility of the marriage market caused by the legal institutions. Um, Going back to your point about whether people's behaviors change in response to these incentives, there's a very interesting book that I think is written by an author by the last name of Fuess. I think it's Fuess. I might be misspelling that. But the book is titled Divorce in Japan. And there's some really interesting data in the book that show that if you look by different age groups, after the legal system changed to make it more difficult to get a divorce in Japan, younger people responded very quickly, right? They stopped divorcing. They're in long-term marriages. But if you look at the older people, even after the system changed, they're still divorcing, right? Their norms were set, and even if it's a little bit of a hassle to get a divorce and get remarried, they're still going to do it, right? So it might be that some people, maybe people who are, more flexible are going to respond to changes in incentives than others.
Do you think that we can rigorously compare the levels of relational mobility between different countries, or do you think that it would be better to break it down and analyze levels of relational mobility in different kinds of contexts? Like, for example, for people that live in cities, in towns, in villages, and I mean, do you understand
Yeah,
what I'm saying?
yeah, exactly. So that's a really good question. I think that both are valid. So a lot of the research that we've done have used kind of mean levels of people's perceptions of mobility in their society aggregated within a group like a national culture. But at the same time, different situations that you encounter will have different levels of relational ability. So that's actually something I'm working on right now is within the same individual, asking people about the levels of relational mobility in different types of environments, situations, comparing their experience when they were in high school to college, um, comparing their own level of mobility compared to their perceptions of mobility in society. Right. So when we measure relational mobility using the relational mobility scale that we developed, we're asking people to report how easy it is for people in their society to form and terminate relationships. We're not asking about how easy it is for themselves personally. And the reason we haven't done that is because we're not necessarily interested in how popular people are or how popular they think they are. Right. But many of the incentives that people might face might actually be determined by their own level of popularity. How easy is it for me to find a new partner if my current partner decides they don't want to be with me anymore, right? So right now I've been doing a lot of research comparing the societal level relational ability to individuals' own relational ability or popularity.
But isn't it the case that overall, throughout the globe, levels of relational mobility have increased historically, particularly since probably the advent of capitalism and the Industrial
Yeah.
Revolution? I mean, worldwide, isn't it the case that it has been increasing a little bit everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, it would be difficult to put together data to definitively show that, but theoretically, yes. So if we were to look at, his traditional societies, so maybe hunter-gatherer, hunter-horticultural societies, typically the people in these societies will be born into a community and they will die in that same community, right? We know that if we look at research done by anthropologists and, we can look at uh, the tendency for people to marry into different groups and so forth. But typically, that's happening a lot more today than it is in the past, right? So I would expect that traditional societies would be by default lower in relational mobility. And then with the advent of things like you say capitalism and legal systems, so systems that allow people to interact with and engage in social exchange with new others without fear.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I meet you for the first time and you do something that's unfair to me, if we live in a society where we have invested in a legal system, we have invested in police officers, we have courts of law, I can enforce cooperation on you, or I can at least punish you for not cooperating, right? And so that actually makes it easier for me to go out and interact with new people, form new relationships, and can create the basis of a high mobility society or a high trust society. And this is something that people in institutional economics have been arguing.
Mm-hmm. That bit about the legal system is interesting. So, would you say that whenever a society has a legal system set in place, then people that move there, I mean, is it the case that it probably reduces uncertainty in terms of what they can expect from other people and how they should interact with them? And that's one of the reasons why there it promotes cooperation, because people basically have a set of rules, right?
Yeah. Maybe the way to study that would be to look at business, right? So, do people, when they're engaged in business, when they're working under different types of legal systems, behave in different ways, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
would you require a larger down payment, from someone who's wanting to rent an apartment from you, when you know that it's going to be more difficult to, evict them from your home, right? But if it's easier to evict them, you maybe don't need the down payment quite as much. So I think that would be a way to study that. I'm not sure, looking at people who move from systems with different types of legal systems. I mean, it could be interesting, but we look at the legal system in the United States, it's not equally accessible to people who are immigrants and people who have lived here for a long time. There are language issues, there are issues with trust. A lot of people come from societies where there might be a lot of corruption, and so they might be more hesitant to trust police officers. People of different ethnic groups might be more or less likely to trust police officers. So that would get really messy very quickly. But if you're going to design an experimental study, I would think maybe doing it in the context of business would be pretty illuminating.
Mm-hmm. And since nowadays people have much higher mobility, I mean, they can move from one place to another within the same country or even to another country. I mean, and if levels of relational mobility are really higher and it's easier for people to terminate old relationships and form new ones, do you think that in the long run this could lead in some way to some sort of social segregation, in the sense that people with similar personalities, for example, over time would tend to aggregate more and more and become separated from people with, for example, different ideologies, different religions, and things like
Yes,
that?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is another topic that I'm studying at the moment. So you get back with me in about 2 years. But yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that this would happen. So we can look at, for instance, classic work, Thomas Schelling's model of residential segregation, right? And so he shows, and this is like, one of the earliest social science experiments or simulations using a computer model, right? So he showed that even if people, so he's trying to understand racial segregation, right? So he shows that even if you create an agent who has a very, very weak preference to interact with similar others. So, we have, imagine you have like a chessboard, a large, large chessboard full of um, chess or checkers, right? So we have like the red and the black checkers. So you have, and you can think about, you have one checker, right? One piece, chess piece in the middle of a bunch of cells, right? Or other boxes. And so you give that piece a preference that it just wants to be surrounded by a majority of people that are the same color as itself, right? It's okay with multiple colors, right? It doesn't mind if it's surrounded by a few black pieces or a few red pieces, but if it's red, it just wants to have at least one more red than black, right? And then you make sure that there's enough empty spaces on the board that these chess pieces or checker pieces can move around. And you just let them move according to their preferences, right? And you can find that if you run the simulation long enough, even with a very, very mild preference for homophily or to interact with people who are like themselves, you're going to end up with complete residential segregation, right? So it's not necessarily that you need blatant discrimination or blatant prejudice to create these sort of types of segregation. So relational mobility is kind of the same thing. We have like this checkerboard, we can move the pieces around. The easier it is to move, the faster this sort of assortment will happen. And so I think that if we look at things like homogamy on income, for instance, so we see that in many societies around the world, in the United States in particular, people who are very wealthy tend to marry other people who are very wealthy. This seems to be one of the driving forces between income inequality in the United States, right? So if it weren't for this tendency, income inequality would probably not be rising as fast as it is now. And so, this might be coming from more choices that people have in their relationships, in their romantic relationships. So in the past, maybe I would have chosen from 10 people. There's probably not a huge distribution in income among these 10 people. But now I'm choosing from 100 people, and there's a bigger distribution, so I'm able to maximize my preference for homophily or similarity on whatever variable I'm interested in. And so we're going to see more stratification in the society based on these increased number of choices.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this could even exacerbate certain problems, like you referred to economic inequality, but then also maybe if people tend to segregate more and more, particularly within the same country, then I don't know, we could get, for example, even higher levels of political
Yeah,
polarization, for
yeah,
example.
certainly. So, when I don't have a choice about who I interact with in terms of their political orientation, I'll interact with anyone. When I do have a choice, I'm probably only going to interact with people who are like-minded. And then we end up with the kind of echo chamber that we currently have in many countries around the world, more polarization, more animosity shown between the groups because we're just not interacting with each other. So I like to think about this as kind of the dark side of choice in relationships. Of course, it's nice to be able to interact with people who share the same values and opinions, but that's on an individual level. On a societal level, it could be very damaging when we only have people who already agree with each other interacting with each other.
Hmm. So that's very interesting because we live in a world where we can move a lot around fairly easily, and people tend to think that because we are exposed to different people, different cultures, and so on more easily, then that we would tolerate other people, people with different ideas, different dispositions, personalities, and so on more easily. But I mean, we could get the opposite effect, right?
Possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that remains to be determined. I have some data that shows that higher levels of relational ability tend to be associated with lower levels of xenophobia against people from different groups. But I suspect that's because people, at least will in higher mobility societies, have some contact with people from other groups and realize that they're not really quite that terrible, but there will still be a lot more segregation.
Hmm. Okay, so Dr. Schug, let's end the interview here. Before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Well, let's see, they can go to, for relational mobility, I like to recommend the website relationalmobility.org. On relationalmobility.org, you can see a lot of the papers that have been published on relational mobility. Of course, that's just one of the topics that I study, but I think that's probably the most interesting site. And you can also explore the data that were from the PNAS paper, where we have data from 39 countries, and you can actually go through and see correlations and visualize and run your own analyses using the data, which is pretty fun. So I would start there. And then there's also the normal avenues such as Google Scholar or, yeah, I guess Google Scholar would be a good one.
Okay, so I will be leaving links to your work and to all of that in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. And Dr. Schug, thank you again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. That was a lovely discussion.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. So to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even just $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Perelga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Jane Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Guidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Annie Ancata, Jacob Klinkby, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingart. My three producers, Izar Weber, Rosie, and Jim Frank, and my executive producer, Mikhail Ruzieski. Thank you for all.